Okay, let me do a quick review of where we have been. A German in the latter part of the 19th century, lived to the early part of the 20th, whose last name was Gunkel, argued that we need to look at certain Bible stories as ways of explaining why things happen. The $10 word is etiological. The idea meaning back in the day, we're talking 3,000 years ago and beyond, villages would always ask why. What did this happen for? Little kids, why did this happen? We found in looking at Neanderthal villages, and let us remind ourselves that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did interbreed. Neanderthals also interbred with Denisovians, and we're now finding there are whole groups of hominids that have now been bred out of existence, but exist as well. They're showing up in DNA, little parts of DNA here. And in Israel, they found another group that is contemporary with Denisovians, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens. It's a whole new group. The DNA has been there, but they didn't know what it was, and now they have found major remains. So there was Homo sapiens, Denisovians, Neanderthals, and this other group. And the geneticists are saying there are probably a lot more that we haven't found out, but they intermarried, and next thing you know, after several hundred generations, you can barely get a glimpse of what this group used to be. So there were lots of hominids running around, and they did interbreed and did produce. So the question, even in Neanderthal villages, there would be an area, a circle, just outside the village proper, and that was understood, we now find out, with a shaman slash reference librarian slash understander of things lived. And this would be the person who knew how to heal and also knew the village and area history. So questions would be asked, as we all do, why do we do this? What's that all about? And things like that. So Gunkel said it's really important to understand some of this stuff that doesn't make any sense to us at all. If you go back 3,000 years and 4,000 years orally, and people ask questions, the answer is, where did we come from? Why are we here? Why do we dress this way? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Somebody would try to answer that. And the answer would start out with long, long ago, or it was told to us by our great-grandparents, who was told to them, you get the way this works. And this happened all over, wherever people gather. You ask questions. And you asked questions too when you were growing up. I asked questions. And so you get the famous thing with Jacob and Esau. Esau lives in one area. Jacob lives in another. And what you find out is that, you get the kids of each saying, why? What is going on with them? They look like us. They have an accent like us. Why don't we get along? And so then stories come along to try to explain as best as they can. Now, you're going to find when you study history, like Plutarch's Lives and other things, a lot of stuff is gossip. A lot of stuff is wrong stuff handed down. A lot of stuff is handed down because it's been amended to make the story sound better. And a lot of stuff is just plain like, why is this even here? And even the rabbis would question that. We're going to come up with that in a minute. So one of the things is etiological, to try to explain and answer questions. You saw that at the end of the story of the Garden of Eden, where humankind is kicked out, Adam and Eve are kicked out. And what do you see? You're trying to explain, why does a serpent crawl on the ground and bruise my heel? Why does a woman desire her husband yet has to have pain in childbirth? Why? These were trying to explain, well, once upon a time, we were in an idyllic state and this happened. Now, one of the things that you and I probably were not aware of ever when we were reading the Bible is where some of the sources from this came from. And the other thing we need to be aware of is inconvenient truths. I cannot stress that enough. And the Bible is loaded with inconvenient truths that upset the narrative, that absolutely upset the narrative. And what really confounded editors was, let's say Doug has something he has put down, and we've got that, and then John has something that comes down, and it's totally opposite. But John's has been around for a long time too, because people remind us of that. So what does an editor do? which one do you pick? And sometimes you just throw them together and hope for the best. Now, an example of that would be, let me share the screen. An example would be, as we're talking about throwing things together. We mentioned before the question was a collage. Do you just throw things together? And this is an example of this. Let me pull up documents and let me pick up the story of Exodus 33 as a classic example of having inconvenient narratives that mess up everything. Where is that? Where did it go?
It was there, EX. You had it there.
I didn't see it.
Right, stop. There.
Ah, there we go. All right, now, Doug, since you're there, I want you to read this for us. Read number 11. You may have seen this before, but this is a classic example of having it inconvenient, and this would be the inconvenient one. Then Doug will read the one that they want you to have, but gets slammed by this. Read this one first, number 11.
Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend.
All right, my class just went through this. I said, is that as clear as you can go? They said, yeah, face to face. God speaks to you as a friend. Then Doug, read verse 17, just the red.
The Lord said to Moses,
And read down here verse 20.
but he said, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live.
Now, is that an obvious contradiction?
Otherwise, Moses just died after he saw him.
Well, the idea is you've got two different strands and two different theologies.
Yeah.
One theology is very inconvenient. The priestly tradition, rewriting and editing in the 500s in exile in Babylon, made it very clear, and they wrote chapter 1, which we'll get to of Genesis. They made it very clear God is immortal, invisible, God only wise, transcendent, and we are to approach the throne of grace on bended knees, not daring to look upon the divine, worms and wretched sinful things that we are. You don't treat God as a friend. But then you got that story of Adam and Eve talking to God in the garden. Then you've got this story that continues. Then thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. It will not go away. It will not go away because it's also ancient.
Are these
So
both
what you
in
did is
Exodus 33?
Yeah. So what you did is what they tried to do. They gave you the first story of creation, the 7 days, and they tried to bury the story of the Garden of Eden behind it, knowing that people read what comes first and not what pay attention what comes second. And to show you how successful this is, I had a Bible school teacher in my class who used to teach Sunday school. And she said, I never realized in all the 20 years I was teaching Bible, there were two creation stories and they were that limited and that close together and were totally disagreeing with each other. So you have then this collage. This was the first one. The Garden of Eden was the first story. The idea that you spoke face to face to Moses, that you and God intervened and were messy and argued with each other. The idea is if there's going to be a divine reality, you argue with this, you know it, you can have some way of connecting. This was found incredibly primitive and offensive hundreds of years later. So then you kind of get the story to amend this, and look at this. Then you get this story. It's not just that you cannot see my face. See, there's a place by me where you will stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back. My face shall not be seen. Now, the idea in all of this is you've got two very, very different ideas. The collage comes first with a simple story of a garden. The collage comes first when you talk to God. It's messy, but you're still alive, still arguing. And that becomes very inconvenient and very, very messy. So plopped over that, so you can barely see it, is the second true message that the priest wanted to be sure that you understood the correct message. And so then what you're going to have is collages, different points of view. And then the other thing that gets really inconvenient is when snippets of things that continue out there that they don't want you, but they won't go away. And we saw that this story about Cain and Abel, when the priests were writing in exile in Babylon, they wanted you to be sure that Jerusalem was Mount Zion, the holy place of God. And this is where God was until those bad heathens were allowed to punish us because obviously we offended this God. The fact that bad political decisions were made, the fact that they may have had an inconvenient or wrong idea about God never enters the picture. The idea is all of this happened because we were bad, obviously, because God is punishing us. And so they remembered that this Mount Zion, God's place, God's hill, to which we will return at some point. God will allow us to come back at some point. The inconvenient truth is that's not where lots of people met God first. They did not meet God on Mount Zion, later to be called a Jebusite place called Salem that gets taken over by David. That's not where a whole chunk of people called upon the name of God. Where did they call upon the name of God? Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is nowhere near Jerusalem and nowhere near Mount Sinai. It's way down south, buried somewhere in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. And what was the God's name that they got called upon? Yahweh. Up there on Mount Zion, the God was called El. And everybody wanted to forget where El came from. El was, in fact, the God of the Canaanites. God forbid we mention the Canaanites. God's name in the Canaanites, the head god, was El. Elohim, El Shaddai. Look at the number of L's you see in the Hebrew Bible. And then his son was named Baal. Look how many names you see in the Hebrew Bible that end with B-A-A-L. And who was his daughter? Asheroth or Astarte. And you may, if you've ever read the Hebrew Bible yourself, they took down the Asheroth pole. Now, one of the things that gets funny, and I think it's funny, in the book of Kings, you find that every king that comes in does the following. He destroys the altars in the high places and demolishes the Asheroth. Well, if you look up what the Asheroth is a fertility pole. Why would you have fertility poles all over the land? Because you have animals and crops. And so it was understood to appease the storm god Baal, who brought rain that you needed for crops, and to appease Asheroth, the Astarte, Baal's daughter, you needed the animals to produce, fertility to produce, and you needed the land to produce fruits and grains. So the idea was you continued to put up the fertility pole, continue to name your kids after the storm god who brought rain, and you continue to remember El, but now you added on Elohim, El Shaddai, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that kindly conveniently gets disregarded later on, but it crops up again and again and again. And then you get this famous thing that Yah crops in. Yes, it's not monotheism. Absolutely right. This is the other thing that people don't get. Moses was not a monotheist. Now, let me explain. Thank you, Danny. The way it crops up in terms of timeline, and I think you're all going to get this. We have a God, and it's our God. John has his God. Doug has his God. Maureen has her God. And each of you know you have your God because each of your gods has its own name. So John's God is different name than Doug's God, and Doug's God is a different name than Maureen's God. And so this is how you keep them separate. Each God has a different name. You notice when Moses is arguing with Pharaoh, if you paid attention to the story, it's really whose God is more powerful. There is no denying there are Egyptian gods. It makes it very, very clear. There are Egyptian gods. The question is who God is more powerful. So then you get the famous psalm that gets sung in Episcopal churches, but I don't know if Episcopalians are understanding what the psalm is. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. let us heartily rejoice in the strength of our salvation. Now, here's the kicker. For our Lord is a great God above all gods. Episcopalians sing that as the Venite, and they don't even realize what they just said. For our God is a great king above all gods. Psalm 95, which means there are other gods, except our God is the big God. People never pick this up. So it starts out with each God has its own name. Then it moves to our God is more powerful than the other gods. And finally, you get monotheism. Finally. So it takes a long, long time. And in the way you try to shed inconvenient truths. Inconvenient truths. Mount Sinai is not Mount Zion. Inconvenient truths. Moses is arguing with other gods. Inconvenient truths. You have Yah. Where the hell did Yah come from? Well, Moses married a Midianite priest's daughter, Zephyrah, and her father was Ruel or Jethro. And what was the mountain god of Midian? Northwestern Arabia in the mountains? Yah. What? Yes, inconvenient truths. And this is where you're going to find, and we talked about this last time, how when we do our DNA, a lot of people find it very, very, very annoying to see what in fact they are. And this is why Carol Ryder always used to say, and I'm repeating this because I think it was brilliant, they said, when you get a birth certificate, you ought to get a certificate with your DNA attached to it in such a way you can't separate the two. And a classic example of this was, and I hate to repeat myself, but it's a classic one, when several of my Cuban-American students who thought this was a riot and their parents did not, pointed out they were Iberian Peninsula, maybe 60%, but then they were 20%, and you know where this goes, Moroccan, Mali, and Senegal. And Nick's hair shows that he is obviously from the Balkans. All right, moving right along. Yes, moving right along. Of course, Nick could say, at least I have hair. Moving right along, we get inconvenient truths. We find out that our ancestors had moments where they left results of those moments, which means we have results in us that may confound us. Now, I don't know what Doug's latest DNA update is, but Doug and I are first cousins. Mine shows that I'm 3% Inuit, and I have a bunch of Andean blood in me now that I wasn't aware of. And I've also got Balkans, Greek, and some Italian. I have no idea where those came from. Saxon, Viking, Scots, Irish, and Welsh, all Celtic I get, Andean, Inuit. So all of you, I'm sorry, Nick, if this is boring you, turn it off. So there. But all of us have inconvenient truths. We all have parts of us that we don't like to talk about. And that's just the way it is. That's true of our stories individually, true of our family stories, right? True of our family stories, and true of, like, for instance, when I was growing up, nobody wanted to mention that my stepfather's mother was Ukrainian. I thought that was interesting back then. They said she was Russian, and finally we dug up all the stuff, and she wasn't. She was Ukrainian. There were all these myths about my stepfather's side of the family until his oldest brother uncovered their father's trunk. And there were all these birth certificates from Austria, Hungary, and Ukraine. All these ideas of where they came from went out the window. Why they were upset by that, I don't know, but they were. So I'm just saying inconvenient truths. Now, having said that, let's go back to where we were, starting at, let me go back to,
An inconvenient truth.
okay. We were back at Genesis. Wrong one. Come on. Genesis 4. All right. Now, let's go back and very, very quickly. we've got the very famous, where is your brother Abel? Notice in this story, God doesn't know. Let me remind everybody, in the very earliest God talk, let's do timelines. And Americans are really terrible at this. Everybody smacks timelines together. Let me give you an example. And Christians do this too. Somebody will say, oh, Kenneth, the early fathers. The early fathers, Kenneth, you don't get the early fathers. And I say, bullshit. Don't tell me early. The early fathers wrote 300 years after Jesus died. Subtract 300 from the year 2022. What do you get? 1722. Is 1722 a significantly different time than it is now? Yes. And I said, if you look at the time of Jesus and add 300 years, you're going to get a significantly different Roman Empire than you did during the time of Jesus. I said, 300 years is a big deal. What you're doing is collapsing timelines, and you're trying to pretend the early fathers wrote right when Jesus lived or just after he died. It didn't happen. We are infamous for collapsing timelines. In the earliest discussions of God, the idea that God created was there. The idea that God was all-knowing and all-powerful gets added to God talk later. And I can't stress that enough. Later, it was not a package. So when God says, where are you? What did you do? It was understood, of course, God would ask this. Why did you assume, they would argue, that God created, that God would know everything? We have got to remember, we add stuff onto the Bible stories that wasn't there with the original writers. You said God created. Why do you assume that God knew everything? That's us. Why do you assume that that's us? So let's go back. Of course, God didn't know. We have to go back 4,000 years. This story was written down about 900 to 1000 BCE. So go back long before that. All right. Remember, in other cultures back then, you had different gods for power. You had different gods for love, different gods for this, but you had one creator. And by the way, Maureen, you have stuff on Lilith in a few moments. Did you look up stuff on Lilith? Okay. So where is your brother Abel? I do not know. Listen, your brother's blood is crying out from the ground. Notice how primitive blood crying out from the ground, very primitive. Well, hello, we're talking 4,000 years ago, orally a story. Now he says, when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. Notice the face, seeing the face, you get the idea of the same writer. You see this again. I can see your face. You get the same. All right. Then the Lord said, not so. Whoever kills Cain shall suffer a sevenfold vengeance. Now we're going to get to Cain and Kenites. I'll remind everybody where this goes in a minute. And the Lord put a mark on Cain. Now, as typical, we screw this up. The mark was not a punishment. Why we say that, I have no idea. It was a protection mark. It was protection. Whoever kills Cain, and no one who would come upon him could kill him. So the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one, that's a protection mark. You get this stuff in grandmothers, you get what's called folk religion. And I told you before, when I taught Old Testament, New Testament, I have a Bible study. The first quiz, which nobody got marked on, was saying, how much do you know about the New Testament? Or how much did you know? And I put down all these quotes. And I said, can you tell me where they came from? What gospel, what book, or no book at all? It's just folklore. Everybody put down all these books. The average quiz grade was 20. And they said, what is this? I said, did you notice it sounds biblical? Oh, yeah. Who was that idiot coach, Mike Ditka, was always quoting the good book in the Bible. Not one thing he quoted ever came from the Bible. It sounded biblical. Somewhere said something and they passed it on. And you're going to find folk religion competes regularly with biblical quotes and biblical stories. You know that. It was not an apple. But you tell people and they'll swear up and down and offer to go to punch you in the face if you disagree it was an apple. There were three kings. You know there weren't three kings. It never said three kings. We've been over that, but they will go to the mat saying it was three kings. Their grandmother said it was three kings. And the great-great-grandmother said it was three kings. And don't argue with my grandmother. And there was Lilith. And people argue about Lilith. Never existed in the Bible. Welcome to the real world. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. Nod means he settled in the land of wandering. Cain knew his wife, and Maureen wants to know where the wife came from. All the people who are non-Orthodox Jews and non-fundamental Protestants said the author telling the story messed it up. He completely blew the fact that he didn't know. He just was telling a story. If you ever wanted an example of an author just telling a story and not paying attention to details, Jewish commentators, rabbis, liberals, and people who don't care about religion all pointed out the same thing. Obviously, the guy didn't get it. He didn't care. He just blattered on. You can't say a wife when you just have Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Where'd the wife come from? Seriously. The guy messed up, or the woman, whoever made this story, obviously, be real, folks, messed up. Unless, of course, it was Maureen in a different iteration. And her sister sent me a text, said, you know, I think that was Maureen. I did get a text from Pat. I honestly did. Maybe. So, Cain knew his wife. She conceived and bore Enoch and built a city. Where are you going to get a city? You see how messed up this is. And named it after Enoch, and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. To Enoch, and now what you do is you get an attempt to explain, an old-fashioned attempt to explain people around you. His brother's name was Jubal. He was an ancestor of those who played the lyre and pipe, etiology. Who started playing lyres and pipe? Why do we have music? Where do musicians come from? Well, you know, way back when, and then you come up with this genealogy. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now look at this unbelievably disgusting story. And this, again, the rabbis say this is a classic example of nonsense. Lamech said to his wives, hear my voice. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me. This is disgusting. There's no getting around it. I've killed a man for wounding me. If somebody wounds me, kills him. A young man for striking me. He's bragging to his wives he killed somebody for striking him and wounding him. And even the rabbi said this is disgusting and paid no attention to it. Yet there are those in religion who will say this is the word of God. If you have a problem with this, it's you, not the message. Well, I have a problem with this. Why would you put something in about somebody, a young man, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold? Now, our commentators said, if you go back to the Kenites and the Midianites in northwest Arabia who worshiped the god Yah, they had handed down an incredibly violent reputation. The idea was if you killed somebody, you killed somebody back. It was one-on-one. That was the law. But the Kenites did not pay attention to that. If you killed one of theirs, they killed 7 of yours. The idea being to leave them alone or the vengeance will be severe. So people tried not to mess with them because the vengeance was out of all proportion. But that was their long history. You kill one of them, they'll kill 7 of yours. So this guy is bragging, I'll kill 70-fold. He really is a very, very disgusting braggadocio about murder and revenge. Then the chapter ends on Adam knew his wife again. The idea was in English, how do you say without offending the sensibilities of the sensitive? How do you say, and Adam went into his wife and they had sex, or Adam went into his wife and they went through the motions of how you conceive? I mean, how do you say that without offending the sensitive souls? So the King James Version of English was knew. The idea being you knew intimately. That's where that all comes from. We don't want to offend sensitive souls lest they get the vapors. God forbid somebody gets the vapors and have to retire to their bed. You'll notice, by the way, that people who attend All Souls tend not to be terribly sensitive or get the vapors. Moving along, Adam knew his wife again. She bore a son and named him Seth. Many of you may have heard this word Seth. Seth means then the successor to Abel. You had Cain, you had Adam and Eve. Cain still lives. Abel is dead, so this is the new son, Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel because Cain killed him. To Seth was also born and named him Enosh. And at that, now look into this. This is interesting. At that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. Now you're going to notice that the story of Moses completely disagrees with this. The story of Moses argues that the first time that Yahweh is called upon is when he is revealed in the burning bush to Moses. So you get two very different stories, very, very different stories, very inconvenient stories. And when did people know about God? Now, obviously, Adam must have, because I was talking. Adam and Eve talked to God, so this doesn't make any sense. You've got three stories. You've got Adam and Eve talking to God. Adam blames God for everything that's going on. And then Eve blames the snake, the serpent, right? Everybody, but they're talking. At that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. So I guess it's more than just Adam and Eve, it's people. Two very, very different stories. All right, now let's go to chapter 1. Yes, chapter 1. Let me get out of this. Chapter 1. Let us begin. Chapter 1 is really, if you think about it, what we call, along with chapter 2, prehistory. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that. As far as Judaism is concerned, the real story that they try to invoke is the story of Abraham. Now, the problem with all of this gets to be interesting, and it's endemic of everybody else trying to come up with a story. We know, thanks to Israeli archaeologists in 1948, that the story presented in Exodus and Joshua and Judges is not true. The story presented to you and me, let me go back for a moment, is this. You had the land of Canaan, the promised land. You've all heard the phrase promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. There is the Exodus. And then after wandering in the Exodus, and they put together basically a group of mixed people into one people. And it took a generation to do that. That's why the 40 years, as it said, a mixed multitude also went up. So you're trying to make one out of this mix. Moses dies on Mount Nebo. And nobody's ever really pieced together why God had Moses die before he got nice lipstick, Nick. That works. You go on Mount Nebo, and then what happens? Do you remember the story? And if you don't, I'll tell you very quickly. Joshua takes this huge army, huge by the way, and has a three-pronged attack on the land of Canaan and wipes it out, and now enters the promised land in a three-pronged attack with all of this mighty fortress of people coming in from the eastern side of Canaan and settling in. The problem, of course, with that is it never happened. And we know for two reasons. Inconvenient truths. In the book of Judges, it gives tribal lists. And it shows all the cities that it says that remain Canaanite to this day. If you read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Judges, you're going to see, and it said, and the Israelites settled with, but also in that city were blah, 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 and next to it were blah, blah, and Canaanites remain to this day. So I remember when we did an Old Testament class, we put up a map and we put a pincushion in all of these cities that they said the Canaanites remain to this day. It was the whole land of Canaan. inconvenient truths. Somebody kept early tribal censuses of who lived where the Israelites came in and where the Canaanites were, and somebody tried to make a map of where that was, and those lists kept coming down. They wouldn't go away. Nobody hoped you would read those. Then I told you there's the famous story of Joshua conquering the city of Ai, A-I. And what did you get with Ai? It means a heap of ruins. So nobody today trusts any of that as being factually accurate. And the Israeli, well, almost, Maureen. The Canaanites make up, D and Way, 80% of what Israel basically is. Where's the other 10% come? 10% comes from those coming in from the south. All those people that immigrated up from the south, refugees from the Exodus, but other people from from Sinai moved in, tribes from Sinai, and don't forget the Midianites. Remember, the great Arabian desert feeds into if the Arabian desert feeds into the southern part of Canaan. Mount Sinai is on one side, but then the Arabian Peninsula at the end, the top of that whole top of it is the bottom line of what we call Israel. People move in. The other people who move in are you ready for this? The semi-nomads from Iraq. If you take a look at ancient nomadic roots, they would leave what we now call Baghdad. It was Babylon back then. They would travel up along the southern, what we now call Turkey, down along the Mediterranean coast, what we call Beirut and Lebanon, and then down into the north of Canaan. So you get 10% moving in from the Arabian Peninsula and from the Sinai and refugees, and another whole group's moving in, and finally, after centuries, deciding to settle down at long last. 80% are Canaanite, 10% from the south, 10% moving over from. Does that make sense to everybody? And so then ultimately, after hundreds of years, you will get together what is called Israel, which inconveniently originally meant let El rule. Is-Ra-El. And then finally, you get a theology from the time of Moses on that will begin to blend. And you're going to find, if you really read the text, altars consistently are up in high places. They found an altar, you ready for this, with Yahweh and his consort. Yes, the archaeologists found this altar with, the Levant is a hub for human migrations, absolutely. You get the Hittites moving down. Look how many Hittites. Abraham buys the land from a Hittite and gets buried in the land he bought from the Hittites. Abraham's always doing business with the Hittites. By the way, I don't know if you knew that. Today, there is still a group of people that speak ancient Hittite. I ran that up the other day. I was looking at something in northern Iraq. I forget what I was looking to do with this class. And there are still a group of people that speak ancient Hittite. There was an archaeologist that was looking for it. He spoke ancient Hittite. The only one who did, he was able to find all kinds of information that went way, way back that nobody knew anything about, where caves were, where this was something was buried, nobody paid attention to, because nobody knew how to ask. All right. So then, in all of this, we have Eve, but somewhere along the line, matriarchy about 3,500 BCE, about 6,000 years ago, matriarchy switches to patriarchy in human writings, and then we get Lilith. Now, Maureen, this is your turn. Tell us about where Lilith originally came from.
Lilith originally came from Mesopotamian mythology.
Stop right there, of course. Now, before Maureen goes any further, we're going to find all of the stuff we're going to soon be dealing with goes back to good old Mesopotamia. Isn't that a lovely word? It just rolls up. Mesopotamia. It just
the cradle of civilization.
One of six. Right.
The cradle of civilization for Bible stories, because
yes, thank you.
We don't get the Mayans much in the Bible. We really don't get the Indus Valley civilization or the Yellow River civilization.
We don't get any of it.
Right.
You're right.
No. We get the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture has, supposedly taken off, and you got settled cities, and then people started writing, and then you get, the Gilgamesh, which is the basis of so much mythology.
Okay,
that
stop just for a second. Okay. I'm sorry, but I'm just want to remind, when you hear Gilgamesh, we now have found two that are much older, and I'll explain that. But Maureen's absolutely right that when we were growing up, there was only one cradle of civilization. Everybody forgot the Egyptians, conveniently. It was always the Fertile Crescent. They forgot the Andes. They forgot the Yucatan Peninsula. They forgot the Yellow River. They forgot the great Harappa Indus Valley culture. That never got mentioned. And it's like Egypt never existed, really. So you're absolutely right. But when you hear Gilgamesh and Mesopotamia, she is giving us a fabulous foreshadowing into what comes next. Go ahead, Maureen.
Yeah, so Lilith is a kind of she demon. She's a wild, uncontrollable she creature.
Say that again. Wild and what? I love that. Wild.
Uncontrollable.
Oh, yes. Do you know anybody like that, Maureen?
No, that nothing rings a bell at all. No. She's not content with her lot in life, and she just does whatever she wants. And she's revered by a certain sect of people in Mesopotamia. They had all these different gods, and so Lilith was just one of these gods that they prayed to. Now Lilith does not appear in the Hebrew Bible in the creation story. This is something that's been added on. Remember when we were talking about the Hebrew Bible and then all the layers of commentary around it, like a circle around. Collage. Yeah, so because the first creation story has this idea, and the creatures of the earth, God created male and female, he created them. So some of the rabbis take this to mean that, well, at the time that Adam was created out of the clay, there must have been a woman created out of the clay. And this becomes what they refer to as Lilith in these rabbinical commentaries. And then the story goes that Lilith was flung out of the Garden of Eden, not because she, ate forbidden fruit or anything, but because she refused to obey Adam. And in fact, she wanted to have sex with her on top of Adam, not the missionary position. And Adam wasn't hearing that. And then Lilith got angry. And then she went off to have sex with some archangel or something because, she wanted it her way. And that was like, nope, you have to obey. And because she didn't want to obey, she got cast out of Eden. And this is supposed to be a warning to any women who refuse to obey.
Okay, so basically All Souls then is made up of a congregation of Liliths. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, but she's not mentioned in the Bible, but she becomes kind of like a favorite, like a favorite demigod, or she becomes a favorite amongst certain sects, because it's always like, yeah, well, we got our goddess Lilith and we're gonna pray to her, and we're gonna we don't want to deal with Adam. So she's kind of like a cult figure. And especially in the Middle Ages, I believe there were certain Jewish texts.
The Kabbalah.
The Kabbalah that dealt with, they reinvoked Lilith and this idea of the uncontrollable raging force of the feminine. And somehow they wanted to tie that into the Shekinah in the Kabbalah, just this idea that there's this wild, uncontrollable female force out there in the world, banished from power, but somehow still lurking at the edges of society.
We see that in politics too. Women cannot, you see men acting badly, but God forbid a woman gets mad and raises her voice or says, that the hypocrisy is unbelievable. I just have a personal story to share with you all, because this always surprises people. Yes, I know I'm wired. I know I'm wired. You might find this interesting. I find that in terms of my own personal journey in life, I do best with women who are strong and independent. And I find that that's what I do best with. I had gone out with over a few years different women who were very, very much compliant. They were very quiet and stuff, and whatever I said was good. And I just knew instinctively that was bad for me. I need somebody who is strong, independent, and said, that's nonsense. That's stupid. No, we're not doing that. And you're not doing that either, and calls things out. So one of the things that always surprises people, like Maria is basically quiet. Well, around me, everybody is quiet. I mean, compared to me, everybody is quiet. The world universe is quiet
true.
compared to her. But it's interesting, if you get to know Maria, she is incredibly strong, very independent. And she also is in that strength and independency, incredibly protective. And so I'm saying that I have always been fascinated with this thing about why portray women that are independent and strong in a bad light.
Yeah,
When,
as
in
demons, she demons.
I
like,
know,
you know.
I personally don't get, I mean,
Now,
intellectually,
do you know if modern day Wiccans are trying to rehabilitate Lilith in any way? Do they claim Lilith to
I
be
don't
one of
know.
their goddesses?
I
Because I
have
don't know
no
much
idea.
about what Wiccans are doing these days, but it wouldn't surprise me if they tried to rehabilitate her and put her back into the pantheon.
I don't know much about Wiccans, except of course it's obviously good, but I mean, I don't, but you know, Maureen mentioned something about also about your tigers afraid in agriculture. One of the funny things is, as we mentioned in this class, apple trees did not grow in that fertile area. They grew in Kazakhstan, 1,813 miles away is where the earliest apple trees, they didn't grow well in that area.
So they think
Pomegranates
it might
and
have been
figs. Pomegranates and figs, yes. So isn't it interesting that a she-demon, now Mesopotamia, let's go back for a couple of minutes and let's talk about prehistory. I'm looking at the time here. A couple of things. You need to know that scholars are arguing that in fact, even though it was annoying that when the priests and the Deuteronomists were each writing their histories of the Israelite people, when it came time, what do you do before Adam? What do you do? And that's when they had to rely upon the science of the day. Now, one of the things that we tend to do in Western thought is compartmentalize. It has to be this, it has to be box this and box that. One of the things that my students kind of get this, when you're doing Chinese thought, for instance, you might find it interesting that when you look at vocabulary for Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, it's often the same vocabulary. It gets interswitched. And when you start really studying Chinese Buddhism and Chinese Taoism and Chinese Confucianism, often you're not sure where one begins and one ends. It's like this mishmash of like a kaleidoscope that keeps on going, and it's like this. Yeah. And so rather than being a box here, and very, very nicely delineated, which is our Teutonic, you know, we shall have things to be all delineated and stuff, probably goes back to Aristotle, maybe. The idea that you blend things together is very, very, very Eastern. And so it is, you're going to find it in Babylon. You did not separate religion and science. They were one and the same. And we all have heard of the Gilgamesh creation epic, but it turns out now that the one that's really more important is the Enuma-Elish. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that right. E-N-U-M-I. I'll pull it up for you. Elis, E-L-I-S. That is the original from which Gilgamesh is taken from. And predating that is a flood story called Athrasis. Now, Athrasis is the most ancient one we go. It's 4,000 to 5,000 years old. And this is the story, as best as I can put it in English. The gods, it all starts out with the gods get mad at humans. They have, the way humans got invented, according to the story is, the lesser gods were made to work and didn't feel like working. So humans get invented to do the work the lesser gods didn't want to do. But human beings, being what they are messy and loud. All right, they're messy and loud. This pisses off, really ticks off the older gods, the elder gods, who want to know why all this noise is disturbing them and disturbing the rest. And they found out the younger gods were responsible for creating these things, so these things have to go. A joy of one of these things, a human being, is called Athrasis. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name. I mispronounce everything once. It's Athrasis, whatever. It's Athrasis, the best I can do. And the gods are warned. The lesser gods are warned. You will not tell them we are going to flood the earth and wipe them right out. So one of the lesser gods, you ready for this, sees Athrasis, and he's talking to a big reed right next to Athrasis, and he says to the reed, "Oh, reeds, I am not allowed to talk to Athrasis and tell him he needs to build a raft and get things on it. I'm not allowed to warn him that a giant flood is coming. I'm not allowed to talk to him." So he's not talking to Athrasis. He's talking to a pile of reeds. This is all these ancient cuneiform tablets. It's a riot. Even back then, they were playing the game. So Athrasis, are you ready for this? Builds a raft, puts on all these animals, and a raven. Even back then, this ancient story with a raven, for heaven's sake. And this story is 4,000, 5,000 years old, and it talks about the first flood. And in fact, we find out that that gets picked up then by Enlil Elish, which then gives this whole creation story, which involves a garden and a flood and then that gets picked up last by Gilgamesh. So what we thought was the earliest is no, it's the latest. First is, next comes Emuish, the big one, and from that is taken from Athrasis. Now we know there was two guys called Ryan and Pittman. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They were geologists at Columbia University, and they were absolutely convinced the flood story was real, because everybody had said that there's no proof of any flood. This is one of those typical stories. So Ryan and Pittman rented boats, big trawlers, and they went through the Mediterranean and they dug down summer after summer after summer. Yes, we're getting there. We're getting there. They dug down and they found there were times that the Black Sea was dry and then it was wet. So they found out it was wet, dry, and then wet. Obviously, something happened. So they went looking at geology and they found, yes, you had the Mediterranean. Then you had an ice age, a mini ice age about 12,000 years ago. And where did it suck up the water? It sucked up water from the Atlantic. And they checked the tables and stuff, and the Atlantic dropped. When the Atlantic dropped, the Mediterranean went into the Atlantic because it was less and it kept on fed. Then the Mediterranean was dry. All right, now stop. Over here, way down here, was a freshwater area, the origins of the Black Sea. It wasn't called the Black Sea then. It was a small area of fresh water. Around it were inhabitations. When the ice begins to melt 7,500 years ago, we know that all happened. The Atlantic comes in, the Mediterranean fills up, but then really fills up, goes up what we now call the Dardanelles, the straits, and there used to be a landmass there. And we've now taken pictures of it. You can see where the water pushed and pushed and pushed. The stuff erodes. And then you get an enormous Niagara Falls going down into that small freshwater lake. Whoosh! 3 years of Niagara Falls. And so if you go to the Black Sea today, what? The 20% of it at the bottom is freshwater. The top 80% or so is saltwater, which is very helpful because that means preserved, beautifully preserved, is stuff at the bottom. Right off the coast of Sinope, you may have heard of Robert Ballard. Ballard was the one who put the stuff that found the Titanic. They got Robert Ballard submersibles to go down at the very depths of the Black Sea, and guess what they find? Human foundations that date from 7,000 and 7,500 BCE, which shows that, in fact, the theory was correct that Robert Ballard had. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's what we're talking about right there, Daniel, the same thing. And so what you're getting is a giant flood. Now, there have been people who said no, then they said yes. And the latest theory is yes, Robert and Ballard, yeah. What was his last name? Robert Ballard and the other guy. I forgot the other guy's last name. Were correct. There are some modifications to their theory, but yes, basically a giant flood did take place roughly 7,000 to 7,500 years ago. And that explains the freshwater part. And the flood story is remembered as trauma, precisely. So that's why a lot of us will argue if you go behind all of these stories, there's usually a kernel of something that happened. It gets retold and retold and retold based upon the tradition telling it and the people's telling it. So you have what's called prehistory. Prehistory, as you study the first chapter of the Bible and you study the second chapter at the Garden of Eden, notice there is no Abraham. What do you do before the remembrances of Abraham? What do you do before the remembrances of Jacob and Esau? What do you do before the remembrances of Ishmael? What do you do? Where do you go? And where did you go, Maureen? If you're in exile, who do you turn to? Who has it all there for you, just waiting for you to pick up?
Lilith?
Mesopotamian myths.
Mesopotamia.
Yep. So you're in exile. You've got it there handed down to you. You don't have any prehistory. It's all there. So A.E. Spicer, who we'll get to next class, E.I. Spicer, wrote the famous beginning of the Anchor Bible for a commentary on Genesis. He said, basically, in a nutshell, the priestly tradition in Deuteronomist took Mesopotamian mythology and they edited. And rather than saying the gods created the heavens and the earth, they eliminated gods and added Yahweh Elohim. So they basically are saying your science is right, but your theology is wrong. Because if you look at the first 7 days of chapter 1 of Genesis, it absolutely matches the story of creation in Unima Elish, which is then copied in Gilgamesh. And you can follow it. You can absolutely follow it. I mean, I'm not making this up. And Spicer actually writes it down. He says, this is Unima Elish, this is Genesis, look at it. You can see it for yourself. Except we know when Unima Elish was written, roughly. We know when Gilgamesh was written, roughly. And we also have a rough idea that the story of chapter 1 in Genesis was written long, long later. Now, does this surprise anybody when you think about it?
No.
I mean, really, when you think about it, we borrow. We creatively borrow. I just like us to be honest about it. And what you're going to find, yeah, absolutely. And what you're going to find is that there are lots of us who love the idea of borrowing, want to know, hey, how, where did it come from? So I guess you might say the difference between liberal religion, in the biggest sense of the word, and very, very fundamental religion or traditional religion is we love borrowing. Where did you come from? What foods do you have? What voices do you have? What clothes do you wear? What ideas do you bring to the table? How do we talk about this? Let's get together and find that exciting. Others don't find that exciting. They find that threatening. It threatens their worldview and what they have to make sense to them. So for a group like us, we like to know, what's our background? What does that mean? What does that do? Ooh, that's cool. I had somebody get mad at me who is, I will not mention the ethnic group, and said, you need to go back where you came from. I will edit the words that I used and basically said, you have no idea what you're talking about. And then proceeded to mention that my background, DNA-wise, heavily, seriously involves what used to be known as the Iroquois Confederacy. Yeah, DNA, we want to know. Some of us want to know. All right, look at that sweet dog. Loves for the day. Well, okay, let's wrap that up then. We have some news for you, by the way, before we go. We've got John here and Doug and Maureen and Francella. We've got Tony Lee from Miami Lakes, Don and Kay from Ormond Beach. We've got Pat, who is residing on Toffville, the upper reaches of Forest Hills on the top with wind. We've got Danny Sorkin, who is our resident, what we need to give you a name for all the stuff you bring us from New York.
You want to call me a docent, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, a resident New York City docent. I mean,
Yes, the docent of New York, Daniel, the docent.
love
of
it.
New
I love
York.
it. I
We
love it. And
Kind of
then,
into
by
it.
the way, we've got our resident Armenian who keeps us on our toes. I love that. And then Serge Cruz is moving. Serge Cruz eloped, got married last night, and moved. I'm kidding. Serge, are you there? Can you defend yourself?
I mean, you're giving me way too much credit. Eloped. That'd be.
Did you get married last night?
Yes, I got married to myself.
Oh. Serge, I won't spoil. I'll let you tell the story when you can. Serge is doing something unique and cool, and I'll let him tell the story when he can.
Apparently he's moving, he might be moving closer to where I live, so that'll be cool. We could have pizza.
No, actually, he's moving a little further than that.
Yeah, I am relocating to Arizona, so we will now have an Arizonian as part of the group to add to all the beautiful cities and countries that we have in here.
Yeah, okay, Doug, yeah, stop recording the personal stuff. Okay, good point, Doug, for security. Okay. Now, by the way, you're going to love where he's going to live. For those of you who are spiritualists, he'll be in Sedona.
So,
Oh,
so
mercy, yes. Oh,
okay. So when I stop recording, I can't go back on. So we're good with the lesson.
Yep,
We're all-
yep,
Okay.
yep,
All
yep.
right. Bye, all.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, friends.